Welcome to All Business No Boundaries, a collection of supply chain stories by DHL Supply Chain, the North American leader in contract logistics. I'm your host, Will Haywood. This is a place for in-depth discussions on the supply chain challenges keeping you up at night. We're breaking beyond the boundaries that are limiting your supply chain. This episode is The Grass is Greener on Both Sides, examining supply chain integration with Scotts Miracle-Gro. We are joined by Tony Botos, Director of Logistics at the Scotts Miracle-Gro Company, and David DeMarais, Director of Operations at DHL Supply Chain. Let's dive in.
Welcome to you both. Very happy to have you with us today. I wondered if we could start just by doing introductions. Tony, can you tell us, who you are, the organization you work for, and the role that you play there?
Yeah, thank you, Will. I appreciate DHL having me on today. So, a little bit of background about myself. Work for Scotts Miracle-Gro now. Been with supply chain in the industry for about 19 years, 15 years with a wholesale food distribution company, and the last 3 years with Scotts. So I've had, various roles, primarily in the distribution operations side, from a frontline leader up to vice president of operations overseeing the network, and my previous role. And then with Scotts, I have responsibilities on the logistics side. So I started the organization into the warehouse operations, similar to my background previously, and then transition over to the logistics side. I oversee about $200 million in spend across different modes of transportation in this world, and happy to be here.
Great. We'll come back to the transportation thing here in a little bit. David, can you do the same thing, please? Introduce yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Will, and thank you, Tony, for joining us. My name's David DeMarais. I'm an ops director with DHL. Primary focus and responsibility is in the Chicago campus, or what we call the Chicago campus in the broader Midwest region. I've been with the company for going on 24 years now in various functions. I've been in a couple different geographic locations in the Midwest and the Southwest, and have responsibility for 8 different operations in the broader Midwest area.
Super. So, our subject today is, the relationship between DHL and Scotts and some of the services that DHL provides on behalf of Scotts, and then a little bit more about Scotts business. So, David, since you've got such a nice tenure here, can you maybe give us a little history of how the two organizations have worked together?
Yeah, so DHL and Scotts have been business partners for quite some time, 20 plus years, and we've operated DCs. So currently we operate in Chicago and Westfield, Massachusetts. In prior years, we've operated in other locations, and just we've ebbed and flowed with the changes of the Scotts overall distribution network. We've been able to flex our footprint on behalf of Scotts during extremely busy times. So most recently, post-COVID, or call it right in the middle of COVID, we were up to 4 buildings in the Chicagoland area and quickly consolidated it to 3 and then to 2, and our current footprint is 1. And while that was going on, we also maintained the 1 footprint in Westfield, Mass. But we've evolved over time with Scotts. And we've continued to look for opportunities to just provide strategic growth and solutions to Scotts as a customer of ours. That includes innovation, service improvements, just different offerings. So we, as you know, our core competency is warehousing and distribution, but we also have transportation in our portfolio of services, along with packaging, e-commerce, and a number of different things. So it's been a great relationship. I would truly call it a partnership between the two organizations, and we've been doing business a long time, and would like to continue on that path.
Great. Thanks for that, David. That's good backdrop. So Tony, I wanted to touch on one of the things that David mentioned around COVID, and I know that affected the sort of DIY craze, affected companies like Scotts. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what the effects on the supply chain organization were, sort of going into COVID, getting through it, and then, coming out of it here in the last year or so?
Yeah, it's where do you begin with COVID and the impact that it had on supply chain? It's the pandemic, it's caused a lot of pressure on supply chain worldwide, and really just the demand on goods and services really increased, through COVID. And so kind of going back to my distribution time, so I was in distribution on the first side of the COVID pandemic coming through, and kind of ended more on the logistics side on the back side. So I remember being in warehouse operations, probably similar to David, looking at, how do we protect our people, number one, and in doing so, you had to establish a lot of protocols. You had to create separation between shifts and barriers and all of those. When you're a warehouse operator, you think about the impact that has on your operation and your ability to move freight through and do that with a lot of productivity. So you have some productivity loss that happens there. And so, how do you adapt to that? And so then you go to the logistics side. All that demand variation just occurred, over a couple years. Ports were shut down, which really impacted domestic transportation, the efficiency from West Coast to East Coast and vice versa. So there was a lot of disruption on the logistics side as well. And so when I entered the role on the logistics side, it was really on the tail end of that. It was still not balanced across the board, and we were facing really truckload conditions where for every one truck that was available, we really had a demand for 10. We needed a lot more capacity than what was available. We had about 50 carrier partners, if not more, trying to help service our account and really take quick action. From my perspective, we had a lot of carrier partners that we were focused on and driving to meet the end needs of the customer. And we really changed our approach to more of a strategic partnership that really drove a high service level. So we tried to consolidate a number of our carriers that we worked with, award volume with the service expectation that we have. We're a high service model. And Scotts, we always expect our product to be in the right place at the right time for our end consumers. And so we really had to leverage our relationships pretty strong with our carrier partners to offset the pandemic and just the variability and demand that we had.
David, from the 3PL standpoint, I know you talked a little bit about what you saw from a utilization or inventory perspective. How were you working with Tony and his colleagues through the pandemic time?
Yeah, I mean, during that pandemic time, the Scotts business saw tremendous growth, and that's what I mentioned kind of at the top of the call. The footprint expansion was especially in Chicago was significant, growing on buildings, and we were already in the process of a facility consolidation with the new building in Shanahan, which if you're not familiar is probably, call it 80 minutes south of the city, if you will. Typical distribution hub. There's a lot of distribution centers in that area, but it was intended to consolidate the 3 DCs that were in Bolingbrook, which is a neighboring suburb of Chicago. And during that time, the business was huge. It was, you think about the impact of COVID and the number of people at home and not necessarily spending discretionary funds in other areas. They invested it back into their homes, and the Scotts product certainly benefited from that. In addition to the facility moves, we also popped up additional overflow space in the Chicago area, all to be able to handle the tremendous growth that we saw on the inventory build side, and then of course the output and shipping side that went along with the push. And the Scotts business is very seasonal. So if you think about the Scotts product line and the big sellers, I mean they're very diverse in terms of products, but the big ticket items that most people think of are the fertilizers, the soils, the seeds. Certainly there's others, but those are the ones that typically have the most seasonal impact. And that span typically starts, kind of late in the calendar as what we would call load in as the inventory build comes in. And then it just goes on the outbound side as the retail locations build up their inventories in anticipation of the spring push. So, and then from there, you just have the kind of the point of sale replenishment that happens as the stores draw down their inventory as customers purchase goods. All that said, big windup, but I mean, I think we were able to really scale up and support, this tremendous growth that the Scotts business had during, call it the COVID boom. And since then, things have changed a bit, so they're not quite as obviously our footprint is smaller in Chicago, and so we've just like we were able to open up additional buildings and ramp up overflow space. Once that footprint was no longer needed, we were able to exit those facilities and continue to operate with a smaller footprint, all without interrupting service.
Yeah, great. Okay, so Tony, when you say logistics, you're talking about transportation, right?
100%. Yep.
Okay, good. So, and that was a new role for you within the last couple of years, right?
Yeah. And, my history, I worked with private fleet and dedicated carriers, but coming into the Scotts world, we use multiple modes of transportation. So it definitely widened my logistics experience and stretched it in a lot of ways.
Good. Well, I want to spend a little time with you on that because we haven't really touched on transportation all that much on this podcast. And I think, following in the learning that you've done on the job, you could share with our listeners a little bit about, how the transportation market works and from the standpoint of a shipper, the different things that you do to provide the service that is needed at the right cost and, right product, right place, all that. So I guess at the top, you said you have about a $200 million transportation spend.
That's correct.
Okay, and so how does that break down?
Yeah, we're primarily truckload across the board. We do a lot in intermodal. Roughly about 25 million in intermodal, and these numbers can obviously flex, as the year progresses. And I'll kind of get into that a little bit. But we have, LTL, less than truckload that we send out at 37 million ish, 40 million at times. And we also operate with a private fleet in a couple of our locations. So primarily our spend is around truckload. I know I'm throwing out a lot of terms here in transportation that if this is a shipper focus, may not be familiar with that. I can certainly relate. When I stepped into the role, it was, throwing out a lot of terminology there that it's like, okay, what does this really mean? How do you leverage it? How do you understand where to apply it? And then you throw in the fact that we're a highly seasonal business. So that also adds an extra variability and it's weather based in a lot of cases too. So you have to, react and be flexible in the moment as well.
Right. Okay. So let's spend some time with a couple of those terms. So, and maybe I'll ask the question this way: why does one use intermodal shipping? Meaning, or what does that mean, first of all, and why do you use it? What are the pros and cons?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think you first need to understand your product. What is your core product? For us, we're a non-perishable, non-hazmat type product. We're shipping finished goods in most cases across the network. And so understanding that gives you the opportunity to understand intermodal and what advantages that can add to your portfolio from a carrier standpoint. So that's leveraging, containers on the rail. And in most cases, we're moving that from our manufacturing plants to our distribution centers. It's critical in those moments when you think about rail. There's an extended lead time that's associated with moving product on the rail, but that's also coming in at a lower cost. Your fuel cost is much less when you're shipping intermodal in the rail, but you also have to look at your transit time. So a lot of times we're working with our planning partners, ensuring that we're producing further in advance, taking advantage of rail wherever possible. And if we're not moving product from our manufacturing sites to our distribution centers on rail, then we're using asset-based carriers. So asset-based truckload carriers, where they typically have a drop trailer. They'll put that drop trailer into a warehouse operation. That allows our manufacturing team to continue to produce and have good product flow. And then we can use that asset to move that out to our distribution centers like DHL in Chicago and Westfield and our partnership there. So, first is to look at, how do we leverage intermodal as much as possible? Now, granted, there are not as many lanes via intermodal as you would have on a typical truckload, So you have to be cognizant of that and work with your partners there to find those right synergies. And then internally, you're working with your planning team to understand exactly how much lead time is needed and ensure that we move that with that as a first option. Then you go to asset-based carriers, and then you go into brokers, thereafter. So, primarily to answer your question about intermodal, that, it's primarily used for our manufacturer and a distribution center, not necessarily out to our customers that can't handle that type of freight.
Okay, got it. David, how do you, from the warehousing seat, interact with the transportation, either providers or folks who manage it like Tony?
Yeah, we work with those groups often, daily. As a matter of fact, it's from scheduling dock appointments to pickup appointments on the outbound side. So, and then there's the brokerage firms, as Tony mentioned. So there's daily communications that happen to facilitate all the movement, both in and out. And it really, whether it's intermodal, whether it's asset-based or brokerage, there's still the same processes that need to be followed in terms of scheduling dock appointments, ensuring on-time delivery and pickup and all of those things. So it's really managing the flow, and especially in the peak times when there's just high demand on turn and ensuring flow is flowing the way it should. We need the product in the warehouse in inventory so we can turn around and ship it out and meet customer orders by the requested time frames and ship at a high fill rate. So it's definitely a daily partnership that is ongoing, and it's actually pretty impressive to see when the sites deliver the peak. It's the Scotts warehouses are not what you would consider kind of your typical consumer good, steady state, maybe a couple seasonal blips here and there. It really goes from 0 to 60 for the peak period for, call it 4 to 6 months. And it's a lot happens in that condensed time frame, and it really needs to happen almost flawlessly in order for everything to be successful. So it's really neat to watch our teams execute, and certainly, our transportation partners are a big part of that process.
So managing just the ups and downs in a normal market are challenging, it sounds like. But Tony, when you took your role, you probably took your role in the most difficult transportation environment maybe in the last couple decades, and it's changed a lot since day one for you to today. I wondered if you could kind of talk through what was the environment like when you started, and then how did that affect your decision making in terms of what mode of transportation you were resorting to versus today, and just what some of those variables are.
Yeah, it's a good call out. It has changed. It's shifted even within the last 18 months from my perspective. And you typically see this cycle. The normal cycle is, there are typically 2 years where you're pressed on capacity and rate, it continues to increase. And then you have this lag of, 1 year where rates are down, and you'll call that typically a shipper's market, and you have plenty of capacity to go after. And so, we started to see that downward slope, at the end of the pandemic, and it's starting to stabilize, and it's starting to bottom out at this point. So, what I've learned in this role is really how close you have to be to the market. The market really drives your decisions. And when I stepped into the role, there was a need for, asset-based carriers and dedicated fleets, and really leveraging the need to have equipment available for our manufacturing and for our customers. And I take a step back and look at who we are as a company. Service is number one. So we can't jeopardize, our service to our customers, and we have to insulate ourselves from that perspective. Now that the market is in a more stable way, we're leveraging those brokers as David described. And so, those brokers, it's one point of contact. They leverage a lot of owner operators and other carriers to manage our business. We have that 0 to 60 effect that David talked about, and that could change from 1 week to another based on, weather patterns. And that allows us to expand and contrast our carriers on a moment's notice. Those brokers in most cases are only one-way deliveries outbound. So we don't have to find, a feedback loop to get those carriers back into those manufacturing sites or distribution centers. So that helps us drive costs down from that standpoint. So we've certainly taken advantage of the market, gone down the path of more broker heavy that allows us to look at rates at a much more competitive level while still maintaining our service. But we're also talking about what's going to happen in the next year or next 2 years. And, we're coming up on a bid that we do every year in Scotts, and looking at our strategy and saying, do we need to insulate ourselves as, this market rebounds, call it, maybe first quarter or second quarter of next year, and look at, different options that help insulate us from a service standpoint. So you're constantly adapting your strategies, and I've seen that already occur over the last 18 months in this role.
Yeah, it's sort of trial by fire, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And David, helping shippers think through whether it's, kind of network strategies, or when do you make the decision to lock in rates versus go to the brokerage market? Is that something that you do for Scotts or elsewhere?
Yeah, not necessarily with the current relationship with Scotts. I mean, those decisions are primarily with, basically exclusively with Tony and his team. So we would not influence, whether we would go asset, brokerage, modal, that sort of thing. So but those are not decision rights that we have. As you know, DHL as a company does have a transportation solution. So we do brokerage, we do dedicated fleets, and the whole suite of transportation. So, I mean, certainly with other relationships, we do engage at a more detailed and involved level with those types of decisions. In the current business relationship with Scotts, we don't do that today.
Gotcha. So Tony, kind of looking into your crystal ball, if you're thinking about, what is a pretty shipper-friendly environment right now, when do you start to pivot to kind of lock things in on a longer-term perspective before capacity starts to tighten again? How do you sense that? I guess there's some art and science in that.
Yeah, it's a little bit of an art, a little bit of a science, a little bit of mistakes, and sometimes getting it right. So for us, we do an annual bid, and we do that during our non-peak time. So what we'll consider summer before we go into fall, and so we're making strategy decisions going into that bid. We do a couple bids out there. We look at our entire portfolio freight spend, and we'll put that out to the market. We'll have some strategies going into it, and then we'll insulate ourselves, on what we believe the market to show us. And so we use a lot of analytics. I mean, we're heavily involved on the, I'll call it real-time analytics on the operational excellence standpoint and managing the day-to-day, but also looking at some strategic platforms and market analysis that help us forecast what we're going to see over the next year. Because we'll make a decision by the end of September on what we believe will occur over the next 3 to 4 months, and that can be challenging in the transportation market to predict what will happen in the future. And so we've gone through a transformation here where we're focusing a lot on technology and helping it allow that data driven decisions that help us understand and forecast much better. And I would say on a warehouse operation side, definitely much further along from an industry standpoint, and transportation has lagged a little bit from, the tech standpoint, but that's greatly changed, probably even more so over COVID, just because of the variability in demand and the need to have that crystal ball. And if it's not accurate, then you're adapting in the moment. So I've seen a lot of other shippers do the same thing and getting heavily involved in that analytics to help us make the good decisions.
Yeah, interesting. And interesting that transportation's lagged the warehouse market, given there's a lot more spend in transportation than there is in warehousing.
Yeah, and from my past experience, you're in the warehouse operations, you're in the box, you see everything, you see it every single day. Transportation's kind of the unknown as it's out there, and so there's been a lot of great companies that have come along to provide real-time feedback, knowing exactly where drivers are, your carriers are, performance both on, pickup, destination, how we're transacting, and EDI and API connections that allow us to have full visibility. That is certainly over, call it the last 5 years, it's just, leapfrogged in transportation. And it's really exciting to see that move forward. So it's fun to be part of that transformation from a technology standpoint, and always looking at what's out there to see how does that fit within our organization.
Excellent. Well, listen, I really appreciate your time, Tony and David, for being with us today and talking a little bit about transportation. Wish you luck as you try to forecast what's coming up over the next 18 months or so, and hope that you make the right choices.
If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to rate us and subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also re-listen to our entire library of episodes on our website, dhl.com/ABNB podcast. See you next time.